In this lesson, we will be taking a look at the discounted cash flow model, a method of estimating the value of a business opportunity or investment based on projected rates of return, and how companies can use this model to assist them in choosing between potential future investments. A discounted cash flow model gives value to a business opportunity. To calculate that value, you will need to project how much money your investment will return, discount the projected money back to the present, and compare the outcome to a proposed return rate. If the outcome exceeds the expected rate of return, then the company might consider that investment. Two types of discounted cash flow models that we will be taking a look at today are the internal rate of return and the net present value methods. Both of these methods follow the discounted cash flow process. However, they differ in how they present the time value of an investment. Time value of an investment is the assumption that the value of money today is worth more than it will be in the future. Let's dive further into the net present value model first. To determine the net present value of an investment, you will need to subtract the initial investment from the sum of present value of net cash flows. You will need to use a present value table and formulas to calculate the sum of present value of net cash flows. The table multiplies coefficients such as years and interest rate by the future value of money to find the present value of net cash flows. Let's assume that you work for a company that wants to find out the net present value for a brand new X-ray machine. The initial investment for that X-ray machine is $200,000, and the expected cash flow from the investment is $40,000 per year for the next 10 years. Based on your calculations and with the help of a present value table, you determine that the required rate of return for the investment is 8%, and that the present value factor is 6.710. Your next step would be to multiply that present value factor, 6.710, with the equal cash flow, $40,000, to determine the present value of $268,400. After all that accounting, we can finally dive into what we came for: net present value. You determine the net present value by taking the present value of $268,400 and subtracting the initial investment of $200,000 and arriving at $68,400. If I were your boss and you presented me with that positive net present value, I would definitely consider that new X-ray machine. But what if the cash flow amount was different each year? In that case, you'd have to determine each year's present value factor and multiply it by that year's cash flow. Then you'd add up all the cash flows to get one overall present value figure, which you'll use to find the difference between the present value and the initial investment cost. Let's say the total present value figure you determined is $219,990. If we subtract that amount from our initial investment of $200,000, then we would get a positive net present value of $19,990. Even with the varying yearly cash flow amounts, the new X-ray machine is still worth considering. Now, let's switch up gears and talk about the internal rate of return model. Internal rate of return is the point where the present cash flows equal the initial investment amount. For the business opportunity to be worth investing in, the internal rate of return needs to equal or surpass the required rate of return. Just like net present value, we'll need to use present value tables to find the internal rate of return. But before we can even start making our tables, we need to know the cash flow number of return periods, N, and the intersecting present value factor. How do we calculate the present value factor? Divide the initial cost of the investment by the annual net cash flows to get the present value factor. Now, let's take a look at the present value table. As we mentioned before, there are two labeled sides, one for the number of the years and one for the tax rate. Select the year and find the present value factor in that row. The column that the present value factor is in is the interest rate or our internal rate of return. For this example, you are the accountant for a car manufacturer. Your company wants to replace welding equipment. The cost of investment is $312,000, and each year the cash flow is $49,944 for 9 years. The expected rate of return for this investment is projected to be 6%. You start by calculating the present value factor. You take the initial investment cost of $312,000 and you divide it by the annual net cash flows of $49,944 to get the present value factor of 6.247. You then compare the present value factor with the present value table, and you discover that the internal rate of return is 8%. Since 8% is greater than the projected 6%, you recommend this purchase to be considered. Now, if there were more than one option, the company should pick the option with the highest internal rate of return. There are always a lot of factors that go into making big decisions for a company, but having raw figures can make those decisions a lot easier.